When I was younger, there were these series of books called Haunted Philippines and True Philippine Ghost Stories that contained ghost stories and paranormal experiences from various people across the country. Some stories were in English, while the rest were in Tagalog. They were quick to read and had numerous volumes. Sometimes they even had a section of ghost pictures near the end. You know, the kind nonchalant landscape or family pics with a blurry figure circled in red. Some of them actually looked convincing and downright creepy. I loved that series, though I should have enjoyed them while they lasted. As of last year, they seem to have been discontinued and are difficult to find in bookstores now. To me, these books were just good entertainment. Growing up in the Philippines provided no shortage of ghost stories and mythical legends. It seemed like everyone had a story to tell or knew someone who had one. I've had a handful of relatives in my family who claimed to have had encounters with a ghost, or multo as we called them in our native tongue. I never thought I'd have my own stories to share, but that quickly changed very recently. My family and I had recently taken a trip back to the Philippines. It was long overdue as I had not seen my relatives and my home country in several years. It was a bit strange to see all my younger cousins grown up. It was a great experience just to see them all again and spend time with them. On our first week there, we were on our way back to my aunt's house from a long day of shopping when the conversation in the car turned to supernatural occurrences. Our culture is heavy on religion and tradition, and we can be very superstitious at times. There are numerous stories of mythical monsters in Filipino culture, and hearing about them from my parents and relatives only furthered my interest. They included the tikbalang, which was a monster that frequented the forests and the mountains. It is described as a large humanoid creature with the head and limbs of a horse. So, basically, BoJack Horseman. The Capri was more of a tale for kids. It's described as a tall, troll-like creature that resides in large trees, where it smokes a cigar, waiting to scare off children that are out too late at night. He's usually regarded as non-violent, though. Another one is a tiyanak, and they're the stuff of nightmares. In remote areas near forests, you'd hear the faint crying of a baby. If you followed these sounds deep into the woods, it could lead you to being perpetually lost. Or if you were really unlucky, you'd find the source. You'd stumble upon what looks like a baby on the ground, but in actuality, it's a small, ghastly creature that will transform and eat you if you got too close. Then there's the aswang, a shapeshifter that feeds on human flesh at night. A specific species of them, called a mananagal, which translates literally to remover, is a particularly terrifying one. By day, they are in the form of a regular woman, but by night, they feed. They root their legs to the ground as their top half detaches itself, sprouts bat-like wings, and takes flight. They mainly target pregnant women, and they have long, vine-like tongues that slither down and eat the fetus as they hover right outside the window. I know, pretty crazy stuff, right? I've always regarded these tales with a healthy amount of salt and a full dose of fear. They were cool and unique, but I could happily live the rest of my life not encountering any of them if they were indeed real. Even when I moved to America, I was still wary of those regional creatures. Anyways, during the car ride, my cousins spoke of strange sightings and experiences they've had, all with varying degrees of believability and silliness. My dad relayed some tales from his younger years about how his group of friends would encounter this and that. He was always ever so dramatic with his storytelling. It was all in good fun, but throughout the whole conversation, my mom remained quiet. She was the hard skeptic type and would always dismiss those stories as silly folklore. However, at that moment, it looked like she had something to say. My curiosity took over, and I finally asked her if she had any ghostly encounters. She looked at me and nodded. Back during her college years when she was studying to be a nurse, she lived on the campus of a very old school not too far from the city I was born in. Living conditions were pretty rough, and 4 of them had to share a room half the size of a normal American college dorm. On top of that, the campus used to be an infirmary during World War II. Hundreds of soldiers from both sides passed through and died within the walls of that hospital. Residents of the dorms would speak of strange noises in the night. Footsteps, faint echoes, and knocking were heard in certain parts of the building. There were rumors that the place was also a temporary orphanage at one point in time, and that a handful of children had died there. They said you could hear children's laughter in the walls if you listened closely. On more than one occasion, my mom and her roommates would wake up to faint shuffling noises in the room, like someone small was moving about. When they looked around, they wouldn't see anyone, so they dismissed it and went back to sleep. It wouldn't be until the following morning that they saw what looked like footprints on the walls and ceiling. They were the size of a child's. One of her roommates moved out after that. One night, a close friend of my mom was heading back to her room after a late study session. She was wary of the supernatural, so she kept her head down and walked quickly through the halls. As she passed by one of the empty rooms, something caught her eye. That large room used to be a triage area when the place was still a hospital. The old rusted beds were left there abandoned, and the room was used for storage. She said she saw half a dozen men lying on the beds. They looked injured and bandaged, and they wore what looked like the uniform of an American soldier from WWII. She stood frozen in place as she felt the coldest chill she'd ever experienced in her life. Then one of the soldiers sat straight up and slowly turned towards her. That was enough to snap her back to her senses, and she took off running towards her room. When she got to her dorm and told her friends what she saw, the brave ones of the group headed to the room to investigate. When they got there, the beds were empty. Ever the skeptic, my mom didn't put much stock in those stories. That is until one early morning, when she experienced something that challenged her stance and bothers her to this day. In the mornings before classes, my mom would wake up extra early so she can get first dibs on the showers in the community bathrooms. It wasn't too hard since a lot of the residents had convinced themselves that the place really was haunted and were unwilling to venture out on their own that early. My mom mostly ignored those stories, and she always got to class early. That morning, she did her usual routine, and it went off without a hitch. As she was walking back to her room, she heard it. She said it sounded like whispers. She stopped and turned around. Down the hallway, a figure stood just at the edge of darkness. The lights weren't in the best condition in that wing, so it was dim. Still, my mom could discern that the figure was dressed like a nun. That didn't make any sense, since there were no nuns on campus and the nearest church was several miles away. Staying completely calm, my mom turned and walked away. She quickened her pace and her own footsteps echoed in the empty hall. She strained to hear any other noises but heard none. When she turned right to another hallway, she saw the nun from the corner of her eye. It was closer and definitely following her. As she got closer to her dorm, she turned around once more. The nun was at the end of the hall, just as far away from her when she first saw it. The nun stood still, as if she'd been standing there the whole time. My mom quickly reached her door and struggled to unlock it. Daring one more look, she turned to her left, but the nun was gone. Relieved, she turned the lock. As she did, she moved to pick up her stuff and felt an unnaturally cold chill. She slowly looked right, and it was right there. The nun. On the other end of the hall. Except now she was much closer, and fully in the light. On instinct, my mom turned the knob and threw her door open. And that's when the child ran out. A small, kindergarten-aged child ran out of her dorm room, brushed past her leg and ran towards the nun. The child was laughing innocently, as if playing a game of tag. My mom watched as the child ran past the nun and disappeared into another room. After a few moments, the nun turned and followed the child. My mom asked around after that experience and learned that the last time there were children or nuns in the campus was back when it was a temporary orphanage several years ago. They shut it down after a tragic fire killed a dozen children and a few nuns looking after them. She never experienced anything else out of the ordinary after that. After she told that story, we all sat stunned in our seats. Mom had been holding out on me. I was thrilled, but also terrified of what I'd just heard. See, at the time, I had a passive interest in the paranormal. It wasn't anything serious and nowhere near obsession levels. I wasn't out to prove that the afterlife existed, nor was I determined to find out if ghosts and spirits were real to find some sort of meaning in this chaotic world. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really, but I'd be open to the possibility. My interest in the subject was purely recreational, like someone who enjoys horror movies or knitting sweaters. In fact, while I like reading up on urban legends and enjoy hearing ghost stories, I'm also terrified by them. My imagination, fueled by stuff I've read and scary movies I've watched, would always get the best of me when I'm alone in the dark. It was a sort of interesting paradox. Kind of like how at one point in my childhood, I was fascinated by snakes as animals, but I was deathly afraid of encountering one out in the wild. To be honest, I was still a little bit jealous of my mom that she had such a cool story to tell. I wished at that moment I had my own story. Well, you know what they say about being careful what you wish for. Yeah. Later on in the trip, we visited my uncle who lived a few towns over. There, he lived with his family where he ran a very lucrative farming business. On the way there, we passed a long bridge that went over a steep ravine with a river below. As our car rode along the bridge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. It made sense since I'd traveled over this bridge many times before when I visited my uncle and cousins. However, underneath that feeling was a sense of unadulterated fear and dread. Like something bad had happened here and it somehow directly affected me. A distant memory, screaming to be remembered. As if on cue, my dad pointed out that this bridge was infamous to the surrounding towns and cities because of the White Lady. Now, like the Kaprir or the Tikbalang, the White Lady is another one of the ubiquitous ghost stories told all around the country. She is perhaps the most well-known, since different countries also have their own version. In America, she's usually called the Lady in White. In Spanish culture, she's La Llorona. The basic idea remains the same. A ghostly-looking woman dressed in a long white dress and long dark hair stands on the side of isolated roads, waiting to hitch a ride. The scenarios vary, but in the Philippines, if you stopped and gave her a ride, she would quietly enter your back seat. If you don't interact with her, she'll leave you alone until she disappears from your car some distance later. If you see her on the road and keep driving, she will suddenly appear in your car and attack you. Moral is, it's better to give her a ride than not. When we arrived at my uncle's large house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had somehow directly affected me. After a delicious dinner and a round of video games with my cousins, I found my uncle out in the balcony having a drink. He offered me a beer since I was finally old enough, and I took a seat next to him. "Hey, Tito, do you remember anything about that bridge right outside of town?" He put his drink down and regarded me for a few moments. He cut straight to the chase. "You were really young when it happened. I suppose you didn't remember it much." Now I was fully intrigued. I had to know. What exactly happened? His warm smile faded and he told his tale. As the story went on, the memories began to flood my mind. Memories that I had long since repressed as a defense mechanism. All the details came to me in excruciating clarity, as if it happened just yesterday. By the time he had finished the story, there was no denying it. I had encountered a ghost all those years ago. It was the mid-90s and I was still living in the Philippines. I was a plucky 6-year-old that was all about adventure and exploring. Once or twice a week, I would spend the night at my uncle's farm, back then a small budding business. The town it was in was smaller then and fairly remote. I loved that place because there were so many areas to explore, but only in the daytime. One particular night I was over at his place, just watching TV. My uncle got a call of a new delivery of chicken feed that needed to be picked up in the next town. At the time, he only had a few farm hands and they all had the night off. Usually he wouldn't make a supply run this late at night, but he was behind schedule and needed to pick up the supplies or risk losing profit. As he headed out, he asked me if I wanted to tag along. Ever the restless child, I immediately agreed. My uncle had an old Toyota SUV that he used for all his delivery pickups. I sat in the second row, my usual spot, while my uncle slid into the driver's seat.